Welcome to Voices of Adoption, where we share unique perspectives, actionable advice, and meaningful stories of birth parents, adoptees, adoptive families, and other members of the adoption community. I'm Donna Pope, Executive Director of Heart to Heart Adoptions.
And I'm Nathan Gwilliam, founder and former CEO of Adoption.com.
Together, we've been part of thousands of adoption journeys over the past 25 years, and we're so glad you're here.
Let's begin today's conversation.
Welcome to Voices of Adoption. We are very excited to be here with Linda Sexton. And Linda, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, well, thank you, Donna. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today. So I am an adoptive mom and started the process over 30 years ago. And I consider myself a pioneer in the space of open adoption. And when I went into it, I had a lot of fears and a lot of questions. And back in those days, over 30 years ago, there were not many answers. So when my husband and I went into open adoption, and even with the birth families, we pretty much had to make it up as we went. And as I got through the process, and as my children got to be young adults, I thought there's so much that I learned along the way. And I think I should share this because today, most adoptions are open. And I know people going into this space have fears just like I did.
Oh, they sure do. And I noticed some of the things that you guys did were you created a communication plan and you had a good relationship. And sometimes, especially like with your second child that you adopted, you know, things in the beginning were a little rocky and they were a little tough. Tell us, first of all, let's start with, as you began to consider adoption, did you plan on having an open adoption? How did it come about?
Yeah, that's a great question. We did not plan on having an open adoption because we knew nothing about open adoption. That concept was totally foreign to us. In fact, we assumed we would have a closed adoption because that was what was common. But what happened was we went and applied to adoption agencies, like the big ones, and we were getting rejected. And we couldn't understand why they rejected us. We were married. We both were professionals. We owned our home. We passed all the background checks. And they came back and they said it was because of our age. At that time,
how old were you?
I was 36 and my husband was 42. And they said we were too old to be parents. And then somebody said, well, you know, there's this agency. And at the time it was in San Antonio, Texas, Methodist Mission Home. And they said they just started doing something called open adoption and they might take you. So it was like a 3-hour trip from Houston to San Antonio. That's where we lived at the time. And we went and we met with them. And sure enough, they said, yeah, we'll take you. And we learned all about open adoption. And it sounded like a beautiful thing. But they couldn't answer any questions beyond the process, you know, beyond this is the process. This is what we're going to do. We will sit down with you and talk to you about the first 6 months. And after that, it's up to you.
So why do you think it sounded like a beautiful thing?
It made sense when we were thinking about the birth mom, especially. And we thought, how do you make an adoption plan with the thought that you may place this child and not know how that child is doing for the rest of their life? And it just almost sounded inhumane, you know, to think about that process. So when we learned that you could be connected to them for their whole life, I thought, it sounds beautiful. It makes a lot of sense. But I was thinking at the time that you do an open adoption for the benefit of the birth mom especially. And I didn't know until much later that the real person that has the very most benefits is the adopted child.
Okay, so you're thinking, ooh, good plan for the birth parents, because now they'll know and they'll feel comfortable where the child's going. You could maybe even think good plan for us because we know more about the biological parents.
Yes.
But tell us why you think it's best for the adoptee.
Well, now I know so much more about raising an adopted child. I mean, I was so naive. Even bringing that baby home from the hospital, I thought they were a clean slate. And I knew I was going to keep them connected to their birth family, but I thought there's not going to be any issues with adoption because we're going to be open, we're going to be transparent, and they will know their birth mom. And we were very fortunate that they knew their birth dad too. But now I understand so much more about the identity as they develop their identity as they're teenagers. That ability to fill in the void really, I know, has contributed to my kids' stability and to their development.
So let's kind of review what your story is. So you adopted Finley, am I saying it right?
Yes.
In 94?
94.
And then when he was 2 years older,
Yes.
2 years old, you and your husband said, let's do it again.
Yes, we did.
And your husband wasn't too excited about it.
He was not, because he said, I mean, the process of adoption is really hard. Let's be honest, right? The waiting, the matching, and we did have a failed match before Finley. And, it just takes such an emotional toll. And so, and if you remember, age was an issue from the beginning. So he started doing the math and saying, well, by the time the second one is out of school, I'm
70 years old.
I'm going to be really old, but, we worked through that, and we really did want them to have siblings. And so by the time we did adopt the second, it was 4 years later. So Sophie was born in 1998.
Now, one of the things you say about the relationship between Finley and Sophie is that they understood each other in a way that maybe you guys couldn't understand. And it created a bond between the two of them that was very important to both of them because of the adoption.
Yes, that is so true. And it's not only that those two were adopted and they had that in common, but they also knew and met each other's birth families. So knowing each other's story and feeling the love from both of the adoptive families, I think gave them this bond with each other. And I've concluded that watching them having that relationship and knowing about each other's stories, I think helped them really feel good about their own story. And it actually helps an adopted child normalize this whole idea. So, one of the things I like to talk about is the fact that normalizing an adoption for a child is so important. So if they don't have adopted siblings, giving them opportunities to meet with other families where children are adopted so that there's sort of normalization to it. Because both of them said, well, I don't really know a lot of other kids that are adopted, and I certainly don't know anybody else in open adoptions. So that was pretty unique to them. And I just think that having each other made this difference, and they do bond together in ways that I don't fully understand.
So Finley, you were there with Jenna when he was born.
Yes.
Now, his father, Michael, I believe it is.
Yes, Michael.
Michael, his father, was not there at the birth. Is that right?
Well, actually, Michael did come back for the birth. So David and I were at the hospital, and we were in a room, near the birthing room. But Michael was actually in the birthing room with Jenna, and Jenna's mom was there too. They did not have the best relationship at the time, but mom was there, and that was very powerful. But when Finley was born, Finley was whisked off to the ICU because they were born with the umbilical cord wrapped around their neck. And they had some lack of oxygen, and boom, they were whisked away. And David and I got the news. I can't even remember who it was, that told us. And it certainly wasn't Michael. It wasn't Michael's mom. I don't know if it was kind of a nurse or somebody, but basically they said, child's in ICU and we can't give you any more information. And we said, why? What's going on? Well, we hadn't planned for that scenario, and Jenna had not signed papers with the hospital giving them permission to talk to us. So they were not able to talk to us. Jenna was in distress as well. And, certainly we weren't invited to talk to Jenna or mom or anybody else. And it was a good 24 hours before things really settled down for us. And by the next day, she had given them permission and we got to see the baby. But it was a tough many, many hours for all of us.
Had you guys met? Had you spent time together prior to the delivery?
Yes, we had. Now, we actually met Jenna when Jenna was 3 months pregnant. And we matched a few months after that, and we lived in the same city. So we saw Jenna probably about once a month. And I spoke with Jenna on the phone a lot. And I know that there's, pluses and minuses for matching early. But for us, it was just wonderful. I mean, it was for us to be able to get to know Jenna and Jenna to know us.
Well, not only that, but I read where Jenna says how important you were to her.
Yes.
And that you kind of had you became a bit of a mom figure to her.
Yeah. Jenna needed a mom. And at the time I remember thinking, I wish I could adopt Jenna too, because Jenna was 16 when she became pregnant. She was 17 when she actually delivered. But Jenna was actually homeless when we met her. And we didn't know that. And Jenna actually hid that from us. And once we did match and we were able to, the agency was able to give her some support, financial support through us, but it was all, obviously through the agency, which was good. Then she was able to move in with her mom. And it wasn't a stable situation, but she did have that apartment at that time. But she told me later how important our relationship was and that she didn't have any women in her life that were good role models. And that's one of the things that I learned actually through both of the adoptions, that we as adoptive parents became role models to the birth parents. And I actually have a chapter about that in the book. It's sort of like respect, it happens even before you really earn it. But there's a lot going on in their lives that they maybe didn't ask for. There's so many issues, and maybe the pregnancy is the capital event of all the trauma going on in their lives, but there is so much more, and they need a lot of support.
So did you have a similar relationship with Rachel in connection with Sophie?
Yes, it's interesting. With Rachel, we had a very good relationship. We had a similar relationship, perhaps not as close, because with Rachel, it was always Rachel and Ricky together. And the strongest relationship was actually with Ricky and Ricky's family, because Ricky's mom, birth grandmother, was very, very involved. And we were fortunate because she was a wonderful person and we got along. She was actually about my age.
Yeah, I was going to say, she's probably about your age.
She is. Yeah, we're about the exact same age. So we got along really, really well. And Ricky really was very strong in the relationship, but it always came down to Ricky and Rachel came to visit us together. And Rachel was a lot more quiet, and Ricky always, spoke his mind and so on and so forth. But we got transferred from Texas to Virginia when Sophie was only 1. So prior to that, we were all in Texas together.
People always ask me, is that a good thing for the child? Will that confuse the child if this biological mom and dad come into their life? What's been your experience?
Yeah, I will say that was a fear of mine too. Will they get confused? There was absolutely, positively no confusion at all. And the children always knew that this is your birth mom and this is your birth dad. Now, they also decided, we talked to them about what do you want them to call you? And they all said by their first name. So Sophie always said, Rachel and Ricky, and Finley always said Jenna and Michael. And that made it kind of easy because they didn't use mom. But they weren't confused, and they knew that these are my birth parents, and they understood, I guess, from the very beginning what that meant, that this is a very special person in my life.
Now, one of the biggest fears that moms have, as an adoptive mom, I have the same fear, and you mentioned it earlier, they're going to like their birth moms better than me.
Yes. Yeah. Well, you know what? They love their birth moms, and I am grateful that they love their birth moms. But my relationship with my children is so strong that there's never been a competition. It's kind of like I look at it like people say, well, do you love one child more than the other? And you don't. You love your children, and you've got so much room to love your children. And my kids love me, and they love their birth parents. And I think that that's kind of just the way it is. But I'm certainly closer to my children than they are to their birth parents. And that's just the reality of I raised them, and, we grew up together. They grew up with us. So they're definitely closer to us. But they love their birth parents, and I love that. And in fact, right now that they're older, I'm always like, hey, did you give, Rachel a call, or have you talked to Jenna lately? And I'm always asking them and just gently prodding them in terms of making sure those relationships continue.
Why do you think that's so important, that those relationships continue?
Yeah, well, we are older. We are 20 to 30 years older than birth parents. And I believe that they have developed a good relationship with them. And I think sometime in the future, they're going to even want to see each other more. But the other thing that I've found is that the sibling relationships have become really important.
These are the biological sibling relationships.
Biological sibling relationships. So Sophie has, well, gosh, at this time, she's got like 9 half siblings between Rachel and Ricky. And Finley also has 4, but one of them is a full brother, because Finley's birth parents later in life ended up marrying each other, getting divorces and marrying each other, and then they had a baby. So Finley has a full birth brother. And, that's just, it's magical. It's wonderful. And at some point, they do see each other occasionally, but, I just want those relationships to be there for my kids.
And how are those relationships? Do they get along well?
They do. I think with Sophie, the strongest is Sophie has a relationship with Ricky, her birth dad's 2 children. And they're like now 7 and 9 years old. So, Sophie's big sister. And of course, they just adore Sophie. But Sophie makes sure that she sees them at least once a year, sometimes twice a year. And even recently, she started spending Thanksgiving the last couple of years with them, which is really nice, so that she can, see those little siblings. So they're very, very close. And then I would say right now, Finley is not as close with the little birth brother. They're 24 years apart in age, but Finley does make sure that they see their birth parents and the little birth brother at least once a year. They'll fly to each other's place, and that's really great.
I talk with a lot of adult adoptees, and what you have described here is exactly what it feels like they're missing. They will often talk about how they've never mirrored with anybody. In other words, they've never looked at anybody that has their nose, their eyes, and and that when they finally meet their biological parents or their biological siblings, there's an almost a visceral response to actually seeing somebody that looks like them.
Yes.
So this idea of not just them finally getting to meet them, but having them as an integral part from the time that they're born. How do you think that affects these adopted children differently than those that don't have that experience?
Yeah, I do think that when we were talking earlier about how important it is for my children, their identity development, I think the looks have a lot to do with that. So when Finley sees Jenna and Michael, Finley is so physically like Jenna and Michael. It's just stunning. And I know that they talk about it and they love to see that in each other. And Finley is very different physically to David and I, and actually different from Sophie too. So it's like that's part of their identity, that it's a piece of the puzzle. It's an important piece of the puzzle, but boy, it's filled. They get it. They understand it. So I think that that's really helped them tremendously.
Okay, so now I'm going to ask,
Yes.
does it make you feel, and be honest here, jealous a little bit? Do you sometimes think, oh, I wish they could look like me and not need that mirroring from someone else?
Yeah. I have to be honest. No, I'm not jealous of it. And I do know that I've never had the ability to raise a biological child. And that is something that, I think it would be cool to have that, somebody that kind of has your own sort of quirks or looks or this and that. But I don't feel jealous of that with my children and their birth families. I really don't. I just think it's something that I recognize that it was a loss for me, and I had a loss in this whole scenario as well. But seeing them experience it, I'm happy for them.
And I know honestly not everyone could say that, because I do know that those feelings exist. So how do you think you grew into the woman that you are that can honestly say that? How do you think that happened?
Yeah, it's I don't know. It was very natural for my husband and I to say, let's adopt. I think that uh, I don't know. I grew up with a mom and four sisters. I was in a single mom household.
What a joy that is, and how much we love to have adoptive families like that, because then they're able to do these open adoptions. Now, people could argue that open adoptions don't always work. And I have to think, well, why wouldn't they work? Well, they would work for the very reason I talked. One of the parties becomes resentful or jealous of one of the other parties, and it creates this tug of war for the adoptee. And that can be problematic. Um, but you're not finding that that's the case.
No, and I think that to me the real magic is that love and respect that the adoptive parents and the birth parents have for each other. Because if the adoptive parents and the birth parents don't have love and respect for each other and don't demonstrate that in front of the children, it can really cause problems. And I think that I feel so fortunate because while the birth parents all did have a lot of trauma they've all matured into really fine adults, and they, they never tried to cross the line, or they were never unreliable. And I know I hear stories about that. And it's so difficult for birth parents to go through this that sometimes it's hard for them to be reliable, and so on and so forth. So you do have to be flexible with what's going on with them in their lives. But just getting down to the respect and being flexible with each other and so on and so forth is really important. And if you have the mindset that you can do that, then it can work. But if you don't, you just have to think about, why are they not showing up? If they're not showing up, or just really being open to what the birth family might be going through, I think is really important to make it work for you too.
And I wonder if this open adoption was possible a little bit more because of the age difference, because both you and your husband were a little bit older than either of the sets of the birth parents. Perhaps that allowed this to be a little easier.
Yeah, I think perhaps it was. And, we were just in very different places in our lives, but there was such an age difference that we were closer in age to their parents. And like I said, they just did see us as stable. And, we were just so grateful to each other. That's really kind of the bottom line. We were so grateful that they chose us as parents, and they were so grateful that we were there to raise their children and then to keep them in our lives. So I do think the age difference, though, was probably a help to us.
Yeah, I think so too. So my question to you is, now you go out and your book is excellent. It's a wonderful book. It's engrossing and it's fun to read. As you've gone out and done presentations, what's been the response that people have had?
Yes, I've done several presentations, and I'm trying to talk mostly to new adoptive families and waiting adoptive families as well. And I've gotten really good response. I mean, people are very engaged, and they really like to hear the stories, and they ask me questions, and I can tell that the audience has the same fears that I had at the beginning, but I think in the end it gives them hope that, you can really do this, and it will benefit the child. That's what I always say. Why are you doing this? You're doing it for the child, because you're going to raise a child that is a lot more stable, and that wholeness that, you can put that nature and nurture together for them, and they'll grow up whole. And that's why you want to develop these relationships. And, people do say to me, well, maybe the birth dad isn't in the picture, or the birth mom really doesn't want to, see us so much. And that happens. And what I say is, there is somebody in that family, in that birth family, that is stable and does want to have a relationship with the child. And as an adoptive parent, you go find them. It could be a birth grandmother, a grandfather. It could be a sibling, an aunt, and uncle. But there is somebody in that family, and they can do a lot to fill in that gap with the birth family. So I think it can be, anybody can take on that role from the birth families, but it's just so important to have some connection, whatever that is.
See, I think a lot of adoptive families would say something like this: oh, thank heavens they don't want to have a relationship. Great, then we're just, it's just our child. And you're going to counter that by saying, no, go seek out somebody in the biological family that you can have a relationship with.
Right, because that child is going to want it and need it someday. It might not feel like it.
So it's so interesting what you're saying here, because as an adoptive parent, we're saying, I want to give my child everything they need.
Yes.
And what we forget is maybe one of the biggest things they may need is a relationship with the biological family.
Yes.
So we need to maintain that.
We need to maintain that. And it was not on my radar screen at the beginning that that's something they needed. Again, I thought it was for me and for the birth parents. I just did not understand. And I do understand now how much my kids need it and how much they've just benefited from it.
So I don't really need to ask you what advice you would give to adoptive parents because you've been very clear. But would you also say similarly to birth families, for the child's sake,
Yes.
maintain a relationship with this adoptive family?
Yes, absolutely. And it has to go both ways, right? The birth family needs to be committed as well. And that's a very hard thing to do, especially at the beginning, and especially as you're working on your own grief. And, my experience was it wasn't just the birth parents that were grieving, it was the birth grandparents that were grieving as well. So you got to give them time to do that. But yes, my advice to birth moms and dads is that child wants to know who you are. And that child wants to know what you look like. And that child wants to know what your hobbies are and, what your interests are. And it doesn't have to be where you physically see them all that often, but how do you connect and let them know who you are? Write them letters, send them pictures. That will have so much meaning to that child at some point in their life.
Now, I know of adoptees that would counter this by saying, no, seriously, I don't care.
Yeah.
And whether or not that's true or not,
Yep.
in their heart of hearts, that certainly appears to be what they are. Well, that's what they're saying.
Yes.
And appears to be what they feel. I don't want to know my biological family. I don't care. I don't care. How do you address that?
Well, you know what? The way I'd address that is that the North Star of any adoption triad is the child. So the child is the one that at the end of the day, what do they need? What do they want? And I do think and know that legitimately there are adopted children that say, I don't need to know. I don't want to know. And I would say that is their prerogative. And if that's truly how they feel, then that's how they feel. And I think they have a right to that. And that every adoption is unique, every child is unique, and it's really what it is that they want. I mean, I have a good friend of mine that's adopted, and that's what she says. I don't want to know. And it's hard for me to understand that, but I'm not her. And so that's just one of the things that I think we just have to respect everybody in the triad and their feelings, and they have a right to their own unique perspective.
So I talk with a lot of adoptees, and I'll ask them, when did you want to know who your biological parents were? And they'll say, well, I was curious in my teens, then I was curious in my 20s. And I will say, so did you talk with your adoptive parents about it? And sometimes they will, and maybe they don't get a really good response back from their adoptive parents. And then maybe they'll, back away from it, sometimes for decades. And sometimes they'll wait till their adoptive parents die.
Yes, I hear that.
You hear those stories all the time. How would you advise adoptive parents about how to allow, promote, encourage, respect this searching nature?
Yeah, I think that is so important. And I think that anybody that's an adoptive parent that takes on the role of being an adoptive parent, that one of their jobs is to always be open to that child with any questions or curiosity that they have about their birth families, but then to also, you open the door, you always let them know. So if they don't want to talk about it, that's fine, but you ask them at various times, hey, if there's anything that you want to know or any questions, or I don't know a lot about them, but if you ever want to search, I'm here and I will help you. That could go so far, and that might be enough for them, just for them to know that you are willing and able to help them in their search efforts, etc. But I think it's really important for adoptive parents, and especially today, if anybody takes on the role of an adoptive parent, I think that's one of their primary jobs, is to help that child find out as much as they can about their biological family when they're ready.
And I would go a little further even than that, because a child is a child.
Right.
They're a child, and they don't know what they want. They only know the reality that they're living in. And they may not even know that they have a need to know anything more. And sometimes that may not come until they're an adult. And then sometimes it's too late. I can't even tell you how many adoptees I've talked to, and they've said, and I found her and she had died the year before. And they don't even know they have this need. So in that way, what do you feel is the responsibility of the adoptive parent? How to walk this line between making sure that they know that they can search, making sure that they may even want to search, and yet not putting it on them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And again, I think it all depends on the circumstances, but you're right. As a child, they're not going to have, they don't know what they need or they want. But as they get to teens, or certainly in their 20s, I think it would be something to really bring up. And certainly the adoptive parents need to make sure that all the information they know and they have is accessible to them. And even if some laws have changed and they can find out more than maybe they used to be able to find out, I think that would be very good, that they just have as much information as they possibly can for that child whenever they're ready.
So I know you don't really want to answer this question, but I'm going to ask it again. Because many times adoptive parents feel a reluctancy to share. And I don't know exactly where it comes from, but I do think it comes from fear. The fear that maybe if this child finds out more about the biological parents, maybe they will like them better. Maybe I no longer, as the adoptive mom, will be an important figure in their life. Maybe I feel inadequate as an adoptive mom. And so there's a natural reluctance
Yeah.
to share more about the biological parents. And how do we get past that?
Let me just sort of add to that. It's not only how the adoptive parents might feel, but I think you're right. It's all based on fear. But let's say that they know something that is not great about the bio mom. What if
If it was a rape and now the child feels like,
right, if it was a rape, or if she was on drugs, or if she was in jail, or the birth father, et cetera, that it's like that they're afraid that the child then will take it upon themselves and feel less worthy or something like that. So age is very important in terms of when you tell them things. And I would say, number one, get professional help to, really make sure that you are getting professional help in terms of if you've got some really tough news and things to deal with. But openness and transparency it's your job to be open and transparent. And even if it's bad news, even if it's something you don't want to talk about, get professional help and figure out how to give the information to that child, because they need it, they deserve it. And if you're hiding, if you're feeling the need to hide something, they are likely going to resent that at some point in their life too. So how do you give them as much information as you can appropriately? I would just say, when it's tough situations, get professional help, but get the help and do it. Be open and transparent, and don't hide anything. They deserve to know it all, is my thought.
So I often will hear adoptive parents that are a little more comfortable with open adoptions. And The biological parents that are also feel that way make the statement, no child can get loved too much. They'll say, with any amount of love. And I picture this child here with all these connections that they have, that will support them. Now, if the connections are pulling from each other in a tug of war, that's problematic. But having these connections with multiple people that deeply love them, that's good.
It's very good. It's very good. In fact, Ricky's mother, the birth grandmother, always said, there's a lot of research and there's a lot of statistics that the more adults that love a child, it is very, very good for that child as they grow up. And you're right. And it gets back to what we talked about before is if you have the mutual respect and love for each other, the adults have the respect and love for each other, and they have to show that in front of the child, then it works. But if they're pulling, can be problematic.
So that brings me to one of my final questions for you. There's a lot of feeling out there that post-placement communication should be made legal, meaning there be penalties if you don't follow through with what your post-placement agreement is. Now, even though I think we would agree that post-placement communication is a very important part, from my point of view, there's a danger in putting it into the courts, because then it creates an animosity between them, and it creates a legal adversarial relationship. And that's the last thing in the world.
That's the last thing you want to do. And I happen to agree with that. Now, we were not in a situation where there was any legal agreement. We did write, this is how we want the first 6 months to go. And then the agency said that if you want to modify that, we can help you do that. But my experience is that certainly before the birth, if you sit down with both parties and agree on what the communication is going to look like, neither party really knows how they're going to feel after the birth. And they really don't know.
10 years later.
not a year later or 5 years later or 10 years later. So you have to be flexible with how you feel and what people's needs are, because people's needs change over time. So I think it's a really tough thing to be able to write an agreement that makes sense and then say, and we're going to take you to court if you don't do that, because it is setting up as adversarial. But more importantly, it's setting you up to make decisions that you really can't possibly make at that time that you're supposed to write the agreement, in my view.
I totally agree with you. And so how do we manage this? How do we manage this ongoing relationship that requires flexibility, requires respect, requires love, requires maturity, and sometimes in situations and in people who maybe lack some of those qualities?
Well, and again, it gets back to when things get tough, sometimes you do need professional help. And I know a lot of the agencies do provide some additional support, but there are a lot of organizations today that are not linked to agencies that can help people. Like I know, birth parent support groups, or therapists that are very adoption competent. Those things are available today. They were not when my kids were growing up, but I think that they're so important that when you have those struggles, that you go to the right support group or the right adoption competent therapist, and they can help you work those things out. So, some of this can be just tough, and you shouldn't do it on your own.
No, I totally agree. And one of the things that I talked with one therapist about, she said that one of the most important things she does in working with adoptees is bring the adoptive parents in. And because it's the relationship that heals. And clearly you have a very good relationship with your kids. And even in this conversation, I can see the amount of respect that you show them and love that you have for them. It's the relationships that heal. So when we are breaking those relationships, whether it's with the biological family, whether it's with the adoptive family, in any way, we're causing damage.
Yes. I think that's absolutely true. And it is the relationships that heal, but it's the relationships that are magic.
Oh
So
yeah.
they heal, but I guess what I'm saying is they heal and they hurt, but it is really where the magic comes. It just feels so much stronger, right? When you can all be there together.
So in conclusion, Linda, tell us why you wrote your book.
I wrote my book for one reason and one reason only, and it was to help the people that come after me, because there was so much I didn't know. There was so much I learned along the way. I'm in absolute awe of this process of open adoption, and I am so grateful to have been given the gift to parent my children. And I just think that people need help, and I want to give back. I want to give back to the adoption community. And that's why, too, Donna, 100% of author profits from my book are going to provide support and therapy to birth parents and adoptive persons. So I'm providing some funds to some of the great agencies that provide support to those two groups, because they need it, they deserve it, and it's just my way of giving back.
Oh, thank you so much. We have loved this conversation. Anything else you want to say at the end?
One other thing, also, please do go to my website, lindarsexton.com. And I do blog when I have a specific story. And if you sign up for my news on my website, and I send out the news occasionally, I will send you the 10 things I wish I knew about open adoption at the start of my journey.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Voices of Adoption. I'm Donna Pope.
And I'm Nathan Gwilliam. Every voice in the adoption triad deserves to be heard and understood.
Visit voicesofadoption.org to subscribe and access additional resources. And then join us next time as we continue to build bridges through conversation.